In any large family, there are always different dynamics, different roles people fall into. In ours, my place wasn't the loudest, the wealthiest, or the one people turned to for financial or legal advice. My career was in a different field. One, far removed from real estate deeds, stock options, or trust fund management. Because of this, I was often seen as someone who didn't quite grasp the intricacies of inherited assets or complex financial arrangements. Naive, perhaps. Easy to confuse. This perception became particularly relevant when it came to the shared family properties. A few acres of land that had been passed down, a couple of old rental houses, some scattered shares in a legacy family business that still technically existed. These weren't vast fortunes, but they represented history, a connection to our ancestors, and had potential value, both sentimental and eventually financial. Joint ownership across multiple cousins and siblings was complicated, and frankly, most of us were happy to let someone else handle the headaches. That someone else was primarily my Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan. They were undeniably successful, savvy, and had a firm grasp on legal and financial matters. They took the lead on managing these shared assets, presenting themselves as looking out for everyone's best interests, simplifying things for the less involved, like me. Over the past year, the conversations had been increasing in frequency and intensity. Phone calls from Uncle Bob, emails from Aunt Susan, always sounding helpful, concerned. They explained that they needed me to sign some documents. It was about restructuring the ownership, simplifying things for tax purposes, protecting the assets for future generations. The explanations were filled with jargon I didn't fully understand. Quitclaim deeds, trust amendments, liability waivers. They emphasized that it was just a formality, standard procedure, nothing for me to worry my little head about. They made it sound like they were doing me a favor, taking a burden off my shoulders. "It's just easier this way, Alex," Uncle Bob would say with a chuckle. "You don't need the hassle of understanding all this legal stuff. Just sign where the lawyer marks it." They offered to mail the papers but insisted it would be much faster and clearer if I just came into the city and met with their lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who had all the documents prepared. They would be there too, to walk me through it. A sense of unease began to settle in. Why the rush? Why couldn't they send the papers for me to review with someone I chose? Why were the explanations so complicated, yet I was told not to worry about understanding? The feeling that something wasn't quite right, that I was being subtly steered towards signing away something important without full knowledge, grew stronger with each call, each email. But I lacked the specific legal or financial expertise to pinpoint exactly what felt off. Their confidence, their authority in these matters, was intimidating. Despite the nagging doubts, the pressure was persuasive. They were family, after all. They said it was for everyone's benefit. Maybe I was just overthinking it, being paranoid because I didn't understand the standard procedures. I finally agreed to the meeting. The morning arrived. I drove into the city, the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Walking into the glass and steel office building, up to the floor listed for Henderson and Associates, felt formal, cold. The receptionist directed me to a conference room. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan were already there, sitting at a polished table, looking relaxed and in control. Mr. Henderson, a thin, gray-haired man with a polite but distant demeanor, sat beside. A stack of thick documents. The papers were fanned out, pages marked with tabs and arrows pointing to signature lines. The air in the room felt different from a family gathering, businesslike, impersonal, pressure-filled. Uncle Bob greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Alex, there you are. Glad you could make it. Everything's all ready. Shouldn't take long at all." He gestured to the papers. I sat down, the documents laid out before me. They were complex, dense with legal language. My unease solidified into a hard, cold resolve. They thought I didn't understand. They thought they could simply put a pen in my hand and have me sign away my rights. They were wrong. I might not understand yet, but I knew enough to know I couldn't sign without knowing exactly what I was giving up. The pressure was on, the papers were waiting, and I knew the real challenge was just beginning. The conference room was quiet as I sat down. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, wasted no time. He opened the top document, a thick stack of papers filled with dense paragraphs and legal terms that swam before my eyes. "All right," he said, his tone efficient. "If you'll just follow along, this is the proposed agreement for the restructuring of the family properties." He launched into an explanation, but it was a blur of legal jargon: joint tenancy, irrevocable trust, liability shield, distribution clauses. He spoke quickly, pointing to sections I couldn't possibly process in real time. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan interjected periodically, translating his legalese into overly simplified, reassuring phrases. "See? This just tidies up the ownership," Aunt Susan said, tapping a page. "Makes managing the rental income much easier for everyone," Uncle Bob added with a nod. They explained that by signing, I would be transferring my direct ownership stake into a new entity, perhaps a family LLC or a trust managed by them. It was presented as a move towards efficiency, a way to avoid future probate issues, and a shield against potential lawsuits related to the properties. "Since you're not really involved in the day-to-day hassles, Alex," Uncle Bob said, looking at me with that familiar, patronizing smile, "this just makes sense. You'll still receive your share of any income, of course, but without the legal headaches. It's much better for someone like you." The more they explained, the more confused I became, but simultaneously, the stronger the feeling of unease grew. They kept stressing that I didn't need to understand the details, just trust that this was for the best. They pointed to lines for my signature with an air of polite impatience. "So, if you'll just sign here, and here—" "Wait," I interrupted, my voice betraying my nervousness. "If I sign this, does this mean I don't actually own the land or the houses directly anymore?" Mr. Henderson paused, adjusting his glasses. "Your interest would be held by the trust," he clarified, choosing his words carefully. "You would be a beneficiary, entitled to distributions. It's a common structure for managing shared assets. But I wouldn't have a say if you decided to sell the land?" I pressed, remembering the old homestead, the one with potential development value I'd heard whispers about. Uncle Bob let out a short, impatient sigh. "Alex, we've been over this. This simplifies management. Decisions would be made by the managing members, which would be us, initially. It's for efficiency. You don't need to be burdened with those decisions." Aunt Susan leaned in, her voice softening slightly, a touch of guilt-tripping entering her tone. "We've put a lot of work into setting this up, dear. Arranged everything. Everyone else thinks it's the right thing to do." The pressure was mounting. The room felt warmer. My hand hovered near the pen Mr. Henderson offered. They were looking at me expectantly, radiating a combined aura of authority, impatience, and a subtle underlying determination to get my signature. They clearly believed my confusion meant I was ready to fold, to defer to their superior knowledge and judgment. But the knot in my stomach was screaming. Something was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just about complexity. It was about control, about signing away something vital based purely on blind trust in people who seemed a little too eager, a little too dismissive of my need to understand. I couldn't articulate the legal ramifications, couldn't point to a specific clause that was definitively wrong, but the feeling of being manipulated, of being seen as an easy mark, was overwhelming. I don't feel comfortable signing this. Right now, I finally said, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of the documents and their expectations. My voice was firmer than I thought it would be. I need to read through this more carefully on my own. Their faces hardened instantly. The polite masks dropped. Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Uncle Bob's face turned red. "Read through it?" he boomed, his voice losing all pretense of calm. "We just spent an hour explaining it. What more is there to read? It's simple." "You're holding things up." "You don't trust us?" Aunt Susan asked, her voice sharp, wounded. "It's not about trust," I lied, though part of me knew it was exactly about that. "It's about understanding. I need to understand what I'm signing." "Fine," Uncle Bob snapped, throwing his hands up. "Have it your way, but don't come crying to us when things get complicated later. And good luck trying to understand that legal garbage on your own." Reluctantly, after a tense back and forth where I insisted on getting copies, Mr. Henderson provided a set of the daunting documents. I gathered them up, feeling the weight of the paper and the heavier weight of the task ahead. The atmosphere in the room was thick with resentment and thwarted plans. I left the office, the silence of the hallway a stark contrast to the anger I'd just faced. I hadn't signed. I had stood my ground, purely on instinct and a gut feeling that something was wrong. Now, armed with a stack of confusing legal papers and Uncle Bob's dismissive challenge ringing in my ears, "Good luck trying to understand that legal garbage on your own," I knew I had to prove him wrong. My perceived ignorance was exactly what they had preyed on. My mission was clear: to understand exactly what they had tried to get me to sign away, and to show them that the ignorant one was not me. The fight for my rights had just begun. Leaving Mr. Henderson's office with that heavy stack of documents felt both like a victory and the beginning of a daunting trial. I hadn't signed. I had stood up for my gut feeling, for the simple principle that I wouldn't sign something I didn't understand. But Uncle Bob's parting challenge, "Good luck trying to understand that legal garbage on your own," echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of how they saw me, how easily they thought I could be dismissed. The first few days, the papers, just sat on my kitchen table, an intimidating pile of complex sentences and unfamiliar terms. Legal garbage, indeed. It was like trying to decipher a foreign language, one specifically designed to exclude anyone without specialized training. Every clause seemed to reference another section. Every definition used words I had to look up, leading me down rabbit hole after rabbit hole of baffling legalese. My initial attempts to just read through were frustratingly slow and yielded little clarity on the actual implications for my rights. I knew I needed help, but Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan's influence and their clear intent to keep me from getting independent advice, by arranging their lawyer, made me cautious. I couldn't just walk into any law office. I needed to be discreet. I started by using online legal resources, websites explaining basic concepts of trusts, LLCs, property deeds, beneficiary rights in plain English. It was a start, giving me a rudimentary vocabulary, but the specific documents were complex, tailored to the family's unique assets. I needed a professional eye on these papers. Finding affordable, discreet legal help was a challenge. I contacted a local legal aid service, explaining my situation carefully, a family dispute over inherited assets, concerns about documents I was pressured to sign. They provided some guidance on finding a lawyer specializing in probate or real estate law who offered initial consultations. I scraped together what I could for a 1-hour consultation with a recommended attorney, explaining up front my need to understand complex documents related to family-owned property and my limited budget. The lawyer, a kind but no-nonsense woman, named Ms. Chen, helped immensely. She didn't read the whole stack, but she taught me how to read it. She explained the structure of the proposed trust LLC, highlighted the key clauses regarding management powers, distribution of income, and, most importantly, the process for selling assets. She patiently answered my questions, translating the legal garbage into plain English that finally made sense. As Ms. Chen explained, the pieces began to fit together, and the picture that emerged was far more disturbing than simple simplification. Signing those papers would have indeed transferred my direct ownership into the managed entity. While I would remain a beneficiary, the proposed structure gave the managing members, Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan, disproportionate control. They would have had the power to sell assets, like the valuable piece of land, without needing my explicit consent, potentially at a price or time that benefited them most, not necessarily all beneficiaries equally. My ability to question decisions, to demand transparency, or to block a sale I disagreed with would have been severely limited, essentially reduced to asking for explanations after the fact. The shock solidified into cold anger. It wasn't about avoiding hassle for me. It was about consolidating power and control for them. It was about making it easier for them to liquidate assets and distribute proceeds on their terms, with fewer questions asked by people like me, who they assumed wouldn't understand enough to object. Uncle Bob's impatience, his insistence that I just sign, his confidence in my ignorance, it all made perfect cynical sense now. They weren't simplifying things. They were setting up a mechanism to dilute my rights and maximize their control over the family's shared assets. My own coin was being minted in that quiet meeting with Ms. Chen, in the hours spent poring over the papers afterwards, finally, understanding their hidden implications. It wasn't money or influence, but knowledge, specific legal knowledge about my rights and the structure they tried to impose. I had the documents they wanted me to sign, and now I had the understanding of exactly what they represented and what they were trying to take. The state of feeling, confused and powerless, was gone, replaced by a quiet, potent awareness. They thought my ignorance was their tool. I was about to show them that my understanding was my leverage. Weeks turned into a couple of months after the awkward meeting at Mr. Henderson's office. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan didn't push immediately, but the subtle inquiries came through other family members. Did Alex ever figure out those papers? Or is Alex ready to move forward on the property matters? The underlying assumption, relayed through their proxies, was clear. They expected me to admit I couldn't understand the documents and eventually just agree to sign out of frustration or continued ignorance. Then, the official notice arrived. A family council meeting convened by Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan, scheduled at a rented room in the local community center. Formal enough to discuss family business, but public enough to gather a significant portion of the clan. The agenda listed updates on shared assets, discussions about the future, and finalizing ownership structures. It was clear they intended to move forward, with or without my informed consent, likely banking on my continued inability to mount a specific challenge. Walking into the meeting room, the atmosphere felt charged. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan were at the head of a long table, looking every bit the confident executives they were, surrounded by files and charts. Other relatives were already seated, some looking interested in the family's assets, others perhaps just curious about the underlying tension left over from the failed signing meeting. I took a seat towards the back, observing the scene. Uncle Bob opened the meeting, presenting updates on the rental properties, the legacy business shares. He spoke with authority, using business and legal terms with ease, reinforcing his image as the capable family leader handling complex matters. Aunt Susan added details about tax implications and liability, nodding along, projecting a united front of expertise. They were, as always, impressive in their performance. Throughout their presentation, they made several points that, now armed with Ms. Chen's help and my own research, I understood were subtly misleading or incomplete. They talked about simplifying cumbersome joint ownership without detailing the specific rights being relinquished. They discussed the potential future of the inherited land, mentioning future development possibilities, but downplaying its current, perhaps less lucrative, state, while emphasizing the need for centralized management under the proposed trust, LLC structure. They spoke of protecting everyone's interests, but the documents showed the structure primarily consolidated control and benefited the managing members more than passive beneficiaries like me. They occasionally glanced in my direction, their expressions hinting at their assumption. I remained quiet, my face giving nothing away. Inside, however, a quiet fire burned. The anger from the lawyer's office, the sting of their condescension, the hours spent wrestling with legal garbage. It had all culminated in this moment. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't intimidated. I knew exactly what they had tried to get me to sign away, and why. I held the documents, marked up with my notes, and the understanding that proved who was truly ignorant of the full picture. Not me. The trigger came towards the end of their presentation. Uncle Bob, summarizing the need for the new ownership structure, turned to address the entire assembly. "We believe this new trust LLC structure is the most efficient and beneficial way forward for all our shared assets," he stated. He then looked directly at me, a hint of that familiar patronizing smile touching his lips. "We understand these legal matters can be complicated for some," he said, his voice slightly raised, ensuring everyone heard. "But trust us, it's the right path. We're ready to finalize the paperwork as soon as everyone is comfortable." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Comfortable meaning, as soon as I gave up trying to understand and just signed. He expected silence, maybe a nod of agreement from the room, and perhaps, if he was lucky, a mumbled concession from me later. But as he finished speaking and looked at me expectantly, my quiet resolve solidified. He had just publicly reiterated their premise, that I was too simple to understand, that I just needed to trust them. He had presented their manipulated version of the right path. I didn't hesitate. I reached down beside my chair, picked up the briefcase containing the documents and my notes. The time for quiet research and being seen as ignorant was over. I stood up. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. Uncle Bob's expectant smile vanished, replaced by surprise, then annoyance. Aunt Susan looked bewildered. They thought they had set a trap for my continued ignorance. They had no idea I was about to spring it with the full weight of my understanding. The room fell silent as I stood up, holding the briefcase. Uncle Bob's face tightened in annoyance. Aunt Susan looked confused. They expected me to perhaps sheepishly ask another question, or worse, make a public spectacle of my confusion. They did not expect what came next. I walked to the head of the table where Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan sat, placing the briefcase beside the stack of documents Mr. Henderson had prepared months ago. I opened my briefcase and took out the copies of the same documents they had given me, now marked up with highlights, underlines, and notes in the margins. Uncle Bob mentioned that these legal matters can be complicated, I began, my voice clear and steady, addressing the assembly. And he's right, they are, if you don't know what you're looking for. I met his gaze, that familiar patronizing look, still on his face, but now tinged with impatience. He also suggested we should just trust him, as he understands these things. I placed my marked-up copies on the table, sliding them slightly towards the center so nearby relatives could see the annotations. "When I left Mr. Henderson's office, I took your advice, Uncle Bob," I continued. "I tried to understand the legal garbage on my own." A few relatives chuckled nervously, recalling his words from that day. It wasn't easy, but I did understand it, and what I understood is very different from what you explained. I picked up the top document, finding a specific section. "This agreement," I stated, my voice gaining a quiet power, "it wasn't just simplifying ownership. When you sign this, you are transferring your direct ownership stake in the properties and business shares into a new managed entity." I looked around at the assembly, making sure they followed. And under this proposed structure, laid out in Section 3, Subsection A, I pointed to the relevant paragraph on my marked copy. It effectively transfers all direct voting rights regarding the sale or development of the land, and significant control over the business shares to the managing members. I looked directly at Uncle Bob, meaning Uncle Bob, If I had signed this, you and Aunt Susan, as the initial managing members, would have gained almost absolute control. You could decide to sell the land, sell assets, make major business decisions, without needing my explicit consent or, in many cases, even significant input from other beneficiaries. A wave of shocked murmuring swept through the room. Relatives leaned forward, looking at the documents, then at Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan, their faces now starting to show clear signs of alarm. When you said it simplifies management, I continued, addressing the assembly but keeping my eyes on Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan. What the document actually does is consolidate unchecked, power in your hands. I then turned to Aunt Susan, picking up another section. And when you said I would still benefit, while I would indeed remain a beneficiary, the distribution clauses here, pointing to a different part of the document, are structured in a way that, under certain conditions, particularly the sale of major assets like the land, would disproportionately favor the managing members. My share, and potentially the share of other passive beneficiaries, could be significantly less than the true value relative to your gain. Uncle Bob's face had gone from annoyance to disbelief and was now turning red with anger and panic. "That's not what it says," he boomed, trying to interrupt, his voice shaking. "You're misinterpreting it. You don't understand." "I understand it perfectly, Uncle Bob," I countered calmly, holding up my marked document. "I took the time to learn. I understand exactly what rights were being signed away, who stood to gain, and what information about this structure you chose to omit when you told me it was just a formality and for everyone's benefit." I looked at Aunt Susan, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "You thought my lack of understanding was a tool you could use to get what you wanted." The family watched, stunned, as I systematically dismantled the narrative Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan had presented. They saw the stark contrast between my clear explanation and the relatives' flustered denials. They realized they weren't just witnessing a family business update. They were witnessing an attempted manipulation being exposed by the person deemed too ignorant to understand. The air was thick with the weight of the revelation. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan's authority, their image as trustworthy stewards of family assets, was shattering before everyone's eyes. They were cornered by the truth contained within the very papers they had used to try and trick me. The battle of understanding had begun, and they were losing badly. Uncle Bob stood there, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, interrupted mid-sentence in his assumption of my ignorance. Aunt Susan looked on, horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. The assembly watched, stunned, as I laid bare the reality hidden within the legal jargon. "That's absurd," Uncle Bob roared, stepping fully away from the table now, trying to regain control through sheer volume. "You're misrepresenting everything. You don't understand the context. You're trying to cause trouble where there is none." He gestured wildly at the documents. "These papers are standard. They were prepared by a reputable lawyer. You're just confused, Alex." "I was confused, Uncle Bob," I agreed calmly, standing my ground. "When you and Aunt Susan first presented these, I was confused. But I took the time to understand." I picked up one of my marked-up documents again. "And what I understand now is that this isn't about standard procedure or simplifying things. It's about consolidating power." Aunt Susan tried a different tactic, her voice tight and strained. "Alex, please, think about the family. Think about what this looks like. We're trying to do what's best for everyone, protect the assets, by having me sign away control and disproportionately benefiting from the sale of major assets," I interjected, my voice steady. "That's not protecting everyone, Aunt Susan. That's protecting your own interests under the guise of complexity." I looked around at the other family members, ensuring they followed the exchange. Uncle Bob's face darkened further. He saw that his denial wasn't working, that my references to specific sections and implications were too concrete to simply dismiss as confusion anymore. "You know what?" he snarled, his voice dropping slightly, but the anger was palpable. "Maybe you did manage to read some of it, but you're twisting the meaning. And you went behind our backs, hired a lawyer? I didn't hire a lawyer against you, Uncle Bob, I corrected him. I hired a lawyer to understand what you were trying to get me to sign, to understand my own rights. I decided this was the moment to introduce Ms. Chen's validation. I consulted with an attorney specializing in probate and real estate law, Ms. Chen. She reviewed these documents. Her analysis confirms my understanding of these clauses. The control consolidation, the disproportionate benefit, it's exactly as I've described. The mention of an outside attorney, a professional validation, of my claims landed with significant impact. The family members' faces shifted from shock to dawning understanding, and, for some, a clear judgment of Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan. Uncle Bob's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who had been sitting silently, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The dynamic completely flipped. I wasn't just the confused relative anymore. I was a beneficiary armed with validated legal knowledge. Uncle Bob seemed to shrink slightly, his bluster losing its force. He could yell, he could deny, but he couldn't contradict. The legal reality I was presenting, now confirmed by an outside expert. He saw his plan unraveling, his image as the benevolent expert family leader being replaced by that of a manipulator caught in the act. "This meeting is over," Uncle Bob finally said, his voice flat, defeated. He made a move to gather the documents, but I placed my hand on my copies. "Not quite yet, Uncle Bob," I said, my voice firm. "We need to discuss the future of these assets, transparently, fairly, and based on a structure where everyone's rights are fully respected, not signed away under pressure." Uncle Bob glared at me, Aunt Susan looking pleadingly. They knew they were cornered. Their attempt to leverage my perceived ignorance for their own gain had backfired spectacularly. They couldn't force me to sign now. They couldn't dismiss my understanding. And they couldn't simply sweep their attempt under the rug in front of the entire family. The carefully constructed facade of their helpful expertise, designed to obscure their manipulative intent, had been demolished by the quiet power of understanding. They stood exposed, defeated not by a lawsuit yet, but by the truth, wielded by the person they thought knew nothing. The meeting dissolved into awkward murmuring as Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan, their faces red with humiliation and anger, began gathering their papers, their plan thwarted, their authority shattered. The battle of understanding was won. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan gathered their papers in a hurried, embarrassed silence. Uncle Bob avoided my gaze, his face still red with a mix of anger and humiliation. Aunt Susan looked pleadingly at some of the other family members, but their faces held firm. Their carefully constructed image as the trustworthy experts, the selfless stewards of family assets, lay in tatters around the conference room table. With a final stiff movement, they walked out, leaving the meeting in disarray. The room buzzed. As soon as the door closed behind them, relatives rushed forward, their initial shock giving way to expressions of concern, anger at Bob and Susan's actions, and overwhelming curiosity directed at me. "I can't believe they tried that," someone exclaimed. "You actually understood all that legal stuff?" another asked, looking at my marked-up documents with awe. People apologized for having doubted me, for having assumed Uncle Bob was simply handling complex matters correctly. The unfair agreement they had pressured me to sign was, of course, dead. No one in that room would ever sign it now that they understood its true implications and the manipulative intent behind it. The simplification that would have stripped away rights and consolidated power was exposed for the power grab it was. In the aftermath of that meeting, the dynamics within the family shifted dramatically. Uncle Bob and Aunt Susan suffered a significant loss of face and influence. Their authority in matters of family finance was completely undermined. While they still retained their ownership share in the shared assets, their ability to act unilaterally or push through self-serving deals was gone. Trust, once freely given to them in these matters, would have to be painstakingly rebuilt, if ever. Their relationship with me, and likely with other family members who felt misled, was irrevocably changed. As for me, the quiet relative who didn't understand, my position was redefined. I was no longer the one to be managed or simplified for. I was the one who had done the hard work of understanding, who had uncovered the truth, and who had stood up for the rights of others, not just my own. The family council, acknowledging my demonstrated understanding and integrity, asked me to become directly involved in discussions about the shared assets. My expertise, hard-won from battling legal jargon and consulting Ms. Chen, earned me a seat at the table I wasn't expected to occupy. Future decisions about the land, the properties, the business shares would require more transparency, more open discussion, and a structure that truly represented the interests of all beneficiaries, not just a select few. Reflecting on the whole ordeal, the initial anger I felt about being underestimated had subsided. The real victory wasn't just stopping them from taking my rights. It was proving that presumed ignorance doesn't have to be a permanent state. My willingness to put in the uncomfortable, difficult work of understanding paid off in ways far beyond preserving my financial stake. It was a victory for dignity, for fairness, and for the principle that everyone's rights matter, regardless of their background or perceived savvy. Uncle Bob's challenge. Good luck trying to understand that legal garbage on your own had become my fuel. And I had proven that the one who truly lacked understanding was him, blindsided by his own assumption of my ignorance. The future of the shared family assets remains a complex matter, requiring careful management and transparent decision-making. But now, that future will be built on a foundation of understanding and fairness that I helped to establish. The properties, the land, the shares, they are more than just assets. They are now also symbols of the day understanding triumphed over manipulation, and the quiet relative showed everyone the true meaning of knowing your rights.